heck do all these dates mean? Hey, I am Chuck the Bureaucrat, and there are 3 dates that are critical to how you calculate your military pension. These are your basic active service date, your date initially entered military service, and your pay entry basic date. Now, up front, I can tell you that if you were one of these characters who joined the Army at age 19 and served continuously on active duty until you retired, none of this matters to you. You don't have to worry about it. For a person who was continuously on active duty, these 3 dates should all be the same. Where things get complicated is if you had some kind of break in service. Maybe you spent some time in the reserve components. Maybe you separated from the Marine Corps and then about a year later you joined the Army. I don't know, maybe you were AWOL for some period of time. And as much as I would like to stay laser focused on what these dates are and how they matter to you, before we get into that, I gotta review how a pension is calculated. Remember that you are either going to get a regular pension for 20 years of active federal service or a reserve pension, or what's called a non-regular pension. Then your pension is calculated using a multiplier, which is 2.5% for high 36 retirement system, or if you're blended retirement, it's 2%. That number gets multiplied by your years of service to give you a percentage, which is then multiplied again times the average of your highest 36 months of base pay. Easy, right? Well, each of these 3 dates actually has something to do with a part of how this calculation is performed. Your basic active service date determines whether or not you're eligible for a regular or non-regular pension. Your date initially entered military service determines what retirement system you're eligible for, which means the multiplier that gets used. And your pay entry basic date determines how your base pay is calculated. Now, your years of service is really a function of your retirement points, but retirement points are a separate issue from these dates. All right, so let's get the easy one out of the way first. Your date initially entered military service never changes. And you can find it by looking on your LES. While you're looking at your LES, you can also see your pay entry basic date. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about how that's calculated and why it might be slightly different than your initial entry date. Okay, if you are the kind of person whose military career has hopped around over different statuses, there's an important form that you find in your military personnel records. This is a DA 1506. It's a statement of service. And while most reserve people are familiar with the DA 1516, the annual statement of retirement points, the 1506 is slightly different. Now, if you want to get into the weeds about the details of how all these calculations work, you can go to Army Regulation 637-1, Army Compensation and Entitlement Policies. And way down in subparagraph 2-5, it explains how to compute the pay entry basic date and the basic active service date. But for now, I'm just going to use my DA Form 1506 as an example and to introduce you to some of the complications you may experience with this thing. First, notice that this form was initiated on March 31st of 2006. That was a pivotal moment in my career, and in a second, you'll see why this form got created, and you'll see why you might have one in your files. In a nutshell, here is my military career up to that point. I was an ROTC cadet from 1992 until I graduated on May 25th of 1995. The very next day, I was placed into the Army Reserve in a non-active duty status, where I sat for just 23 days before heading off to my very first active duty assignment. From there until June 17th of 1999, I was on active duty. Officer basic course, first duty station, deployment to Egypt, that kind of thing. Then I went back into the Individual Ready Reserve for almost 2 years. In June of 2001, I switched back to TPU status, where I cheerfully stayed until I was mobilized on May 17, 2004. In August of 2005, I joined the AGR program, where I stayed until I finally retired. So, in 2006, with all this Jumping around from status to status, HRC realized that they were going to have to recalculate my pay entry basic date and my basic active service date. And you can see from this form what they came up with. Now, I just got to say that this old-timey form is not exactly easy to understand. This is the 1987 version, and you really got to comb through some regulations to understand what's happening here. But the good news is that in 2022, they updated this form. So while most of you old dogs are going to have to make do with the old form, at least at some point in the future, things are going to get better. In fact, what I want to do is show you what my numbers look like if we put them into this new form. Because you get the same results, but the process is much more clear. Okay, I had 9 different periods of service from my ROTC days until I was AGR. So I'm just copying the dates from the old form to the new form. The important thing on this new form is that block 4D titled Credible. You mark whether a period is credible for pay, for active duty, or nothing. So when I was an ROTC cadet, my time wasn't credible for either. When I was on active duty, it was credible for both, but when I was in the Individual Ready Reserve, or TPU, the time was credible for pay, but not active duty. The other thing that's nice about this new form is block 4G, active duty points. On the old form, that 1 month and 23 days was just kind of scribbled in. It wasn't really clear what it was all about. But you see, those are the days that I spent on annual training or active duty for training while I was in a TPU status. It's not my retirement points. I earned a heck of a lot more than 53 retirement points in those 3 years. So back to the 1506. For each period of service, there's a computation of the length of that service in years, months, and days. What is different on the new form is that these computations are put into 2 columns on the second page. The left-hand column only shows the length of service if it is credible for pay, that is, the box in 4D is checked for pay, and the column on the right only shows the length of service if it is credible for active duty. So, for example, my time in the Individual Ready Reserve is credible for pay, but not for active duty. And my time on active duty in the late 1990s is credible for both pay and active duty. All right, real quick. How did we get 3 years, 11 months, and 29 days of active duty time from my service in the late 90s? Well, to start with, we're just going to subtract my start date from my end date. And this is where some high-speed arithmetic is going to come in. To subtract 19 days from 17 days, we borrow 1 month from the end date and add 30 days. And it doesn't matter how long the month is. For this calculation, all months are treated as 30 days long. So 47 minus 19, that gives us 28. To subtract 6 months from 5, we're going to borrow 1 year, that's 12 months. So 17 minus 6 is 11. And 1998 minus 1995, that gives us 3 years. But see how we're off by 1 day from the calculation sheet? That's because the dates listed are inclusive. I served the full day of June 17th, 1999. So we have to add 1 day, and it matches the official result. All right, so let's go back to these columns we have in this new version of DA Form 1506. What we do is add up the total days and months and years, and that same rule about 30 days in a month and 12 months in a year is going to apply. Like if we sum up this column, we get 95 days, so we're going to keep the 5 days and add 3 more months. And then we use these totals of service for pay and active service to determine the related service dates. 6A and 6G are the beginning date to the most recent period of service. You take the totals from 5B and 5D. Then you convert these results into a calendar date by subtracting the total service from that date. And it's just as easy as pie. Not. Look, I got a PhD in statistics and I spent most of my working life in the bureaucratic heart of the Pentagon. And it took me 3 days to figure out this math. So if you have a non-traditional career like mine and you want to make sure that there's not some kind of math error screwing up your pension, take the time early on in the process to check to make sure that HRC didn't make some kind of mistake. And by the way, if you want to know how to access all of these documents, and particularly your DD-214s, watch this video.